In 2020, a submersible from the research vessel Ocean Explorer slowly descended into the dark waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The cameras recorded what they always record at great depths: dismal gray silt, occasional tube worms, and slowly crawling crabs covered in a whitish crust of salt. Nothing unexpected. Nothing that would make the operators in the control center look away from their monitors. And then the vehicle descended a bit lower, and everyone fell silent at once. Before the camera lay a lake, a real lake, with a smooth, almost mirror-like surface, with a shoreline, and with waves that rippled from the touch of the submersible. A lake at the bottom of the ocean, a body of water within a body of water, water in water, but so different that a clear, visible boundary passed between them, like between oil and vinegar in a salad dressing. Along the shores of the lake, mussels and tube worms grew in such quantities that the shore literally wriggled, and the fish that accidentally swam inside this lake swam out of it already dead, or did not swim out at all. This phenomenon is called a brine lake, or brine, from the English word brine, and it exists despite everything that seems intuitively understandable about how the ocean is structured. To understand why underwater lakes are possible at all, we need to return briefly to basic physics. Water mixes with water. This seems so obvious that we usually do not think of it as a fact requiring explanation. Pour a glass of water into a bucket of water, and after a few minutes, it is just one water. No boundary, no separation. That is why, when river waters flow into the sea, they mix with the marine waters. They do not float on top of them as a separate layer forever. But there is an exception to this rule, and it is related to density. If the difference in density between two liquids is large enough, they do not mix, or they mix very slowly, maintaining an interface for a long time. This is exactly what happens in underwater lakes. The water in them is so saturated with salt that its density is 3 to 5 times greater than the density of ordinary seawater. Such brine is heavier than the surrounding ocean and sinks to the bottom, where it lies as a separate layer, stable, almost motionless, almost alive. Where does so much salt come from on the ocean floor? This is a question that led researchers to another amazing discovery about what was happening to our planet millions of years ago. About 25 million years ago, the Atlantic Ocean was significantly smaller than it is today. During tectonic processes, some of its parts were periodically isolated from the main water area, turning into closed seas without a connection to the open ocean. In a tropical climate, these enclosed bodies of water evaporated intensely and evaporated until they evaporated almost completely. From them remained huge layers of salt, kilometer-thick beds of halite, anhydrite, and other minerals, buried under subsequent layers of sedimentary rocks. At the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, the thickness of such salt beds in some places reaches 8 kilometers. This is a colossal volume, greater than the height of Everest. Salt does not lie motionless. Under the pressure of overlying rocks, it behaves almost like a very viscous liquid, slowly flowing, rising in domes, and breaking through cracks in the rock. When such a salt dome reaches the seafloor and comes into contact with bottom water, its gradual dissolution begins. The brine formed as a result is heavier than the surrounding water and goes nowhere. It accumulates in relief depressions, fills sinkholes and cracks, forming lakes. The process takes thousands of years. Some of the underwater lakes known to us were formed, according to scientists' estimates, over 10 to 100,000 years. They did not appear suddenly. They accumulated as slowly and inevitably as a debt that no one intends to pay back. Interestingly, the salt domes themselves are not static. They continue to move even today, slowly, at a few millimeters per year, but unstoppably. This means that the configuration of brine lakes changes over time. Some lakes expand, others shrink, and others may merge or divide. The bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, in this sense, is a living landscape that is transforming right now, just too slowly to be noticeable on the scale of a human life. The first underwater brine lake was discovered in the Red Sea as early as the 1960s, almost by accident, during oceanographic expeditions. But then it was considered a geological anomaly, curious but isolated. No one assumed that such formations could be a common phenomenon. Decades passed before improvements in deep-sea research technology allowed them to be detected systematically. Today, underwater brine lakes have been found in the Gulf of Mexico, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, and in several other regions of the world ocean. Some of them are quite small, a few meters across, while others are striking in their size. Lake Assal in the Red Sea occupies an area of several square kilometers and has a depth of more than 200 meters. It is an entire underwater body of water within the ocean, with its own bottom relief, its own shoreline, its own inhabitants, and its own special water chemistry. It is the chemistry that makes brines truly strange. Not only is a huge amount of salt dissolved in brine lakes, but depending on the composition of the salt rock from which they were formed, the water in them can contain colossal concentrations of hydrogen sulfide, methane, heavy metals, copper, zinc, and iron. The temperature of the brine in some lakes reaches 60 or even 70 degrees Celsius. Not because of volcanic activity, but because of geothermal heating that does not dissipate in such a dense and stationary environment. The oxygen content in the brine is vanishingly small or equal to zero. For most known forms of life, such water is instantly lethal, hence the name lethal lakes, which is sometimes applied to them. A fish swimming into the brine dies within a few minutes. A crab that accidentally descends onto the surface of the lake swims out stunned and confused, if it swims out at all. During underwater filming, researchers have observed real graveyards on the shores of brine lakes, accumulations of dead fish and invertebrates washed onto the interface by currents. And yet, life is here. This is perhaps the most striking part of the whole story. Along the shores of underwater brine lakes, in that narrow zone where normal seawater gradually mixes with brine, where conditions are not yet lethal but are already extreme, exceptionally dense biological communities are formed. Mussels, tube worms, specialized crustaceans, and polychaetes. All of them are found here in concentrations that are orders of magnitude higher than the usual level for the deep-sea floor. This seems paradoxical. The closer to a deadly environment, the more life there is. But the logic here is its own. The brine constantly releases methane and hydrogen sulfide, which serve as fuel for bacteria, and bacteria serve as food for everyone else. The lake itself feeds its inhabitants, and the closer to the food source, the more advantageous the position, up to that boundary beyond which conditions become incompatible with life. The shores of brine lakes resemble oases in the desert, islands of life in the middle of a nutrient-poor deep-sea space. What feeds this life? Not photosynthesis. At a depth of several hundred meters, sunlight does not reach the bottom. The answer lies in the chemistry of the brine itself. At the interface between the brine and normal water, active chemical reactions occur. Methane and hydrogen sulfide coming out of the brine are oxidized by bacteria, which use this chemical energy instead of solar energy. This process is called chemosynthesis, and it is the basis of the food chain. In these extreme communities, bacteria become food for filter feeders, and those become food for predators. The entire ecosystem works on the energy of chemical reactions without a single photon of sunlight. This discovery overturned some basic ideas about where life can exist at all. Until the moment scientists began to systematically study chemosynthetic ecosystems, the belief prevailed that all life on Earth directly or indirectly depends on solar energy. Brine lakes, along with hydrothermal vents, proved that this is not the case. Life can exist in complete darkness, under colossal pressure, in water that would kill most known organisms, using as an energy source reactions that have nothing to do with the sun. It was this discovery that made brine lakes particularly interesting for astrobiologists, scientists studying the possibility of life beyond Earth. Among the objects in the solar system where, according to scientists, life could theoretically exist, the moons of Jupiter and Saturn occupy a special place. Europa, a frozen moon of Jupiter, apparently hides a huge liquid ocean under its frozen surface. Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, actively ejects geysers into space, in whose composition water, organic molecules, and molecular hydrogen have been found. Both of these objects are devoid of sunlight in an amount that could support photosynthesis. But if life can exist in the chemosynthetic ecosystems of the brine lakes of the Gulf of Mexico, then why can it not exist in similar conditions on Europa or Enceladus? Scientists researching deep-sea brine lakes explicitly state that this work has significance far beyond oceanography. Every organism found here, every biochemical mechanism described, expands our understanding of what constitutes habitable conditions, and every such expansion makes the universe a little more populated, at least in theory. Now let's return underwater, because there are still a few mysteries in brine lakes that science has not yet explained satisfactorily. One of them is related to time. Scientists can approximately estimate the age of brine lakes by the rate of dissolution of salt beds and the rate of brine accumulation. Some of the discovered lakes turned out to be surprisingly young, a few thousand years old. Others, according to calculations, have existed for tens of thousands of years. But the strangest thing is that some lakes show signs that their composition has changed over time, and changed non-linearly. Periods of active brine inflow alternated with periods of stabilization. The lake level rose and fell. What governed these cycles? Tectonic plate movement, changes in pressure in the salt beds, or seismic activity? There are no answers yet. Another mystery concerns the organisms themselves living in brine lakes. In the brine, where there is no oxygen at all and the concentration of toxic substances is at its maximum, microorganisms live. They do not just survive, they live, reproduce, and form communities. These organisms are extremophiles, adapted to conditions in which the very idea of life seems absurd. Many of them belong to the domain Archaea, the oldest of the three main branches of life on Earth. Their biochemistry is so different from what we are used to that studying these creatures is essentially studying alternative principles of life organization. Some of these microorganisms can do something truly amazing. They are capable of existing in conditions of almost total absence of water in the usual sense, because at such high salt concentrations, water molecules are so busy interacting with salt ions that they are practically unavailable for biochemical reactions. The cells of these organisms have developed very special mechanisms for maintaining normal osmotic pressure. In essence, they have learned to live in an environment that continuously tries to pull water out of them. This requires colossal biochemical efforts and completely non-trivial molecular solutions. The study of these mechanisms has opened several important pages in the history of understanding how life works at the molecular level. Underwater brine lakes are also interesting from a purely practical point of view, which is usually not mentioned in popular science articles. They are ideal sediment traps. Everything that sinks to the bottom in the area of a brine lake falls into an environment with minimal biological activity and almost zero oxygen content. In such conditions, organic substances decompose exceptionally slowly and can be preserved for millennia in an almost untouched form. This is why some scientists view brine lakes as a kind of archive, repositories of biological and geochemical material that can tell much more about the past of the ocean than ordinary bottom sediments. In the Mediterranean Sea, at a depth of more than 3 kilometers, several large brine lakes were discovered back in the 1990s. The most famous of them are Lake Atlantis II in the Red Sea and the lakes of the Latalante Basin in the Mediterranean. In these places, brine accumulated in basins of the seafloor where bottom currents do not penetrate. The isolation of these bodies of water is so high that scientists have found organic molecules in their brine that are several thousand years old, practically unchanged from the moment they settled on the bottom. It is like finding an open jar of jam made thousands of years ago and finding that the jam has hardly changed. What happens when a submersible descends into a brine lake? This question is not just rhetorical. Several research groups have conducted exactly such experiments. The vehicle crosses the interface, and the cameras record something similar to what is seen when diving into a very thick fog. Visibility drops sharply. The interface shimmers and glimmers like heated air over asphalt on a hot day. This is refraction, the refraction of light at the boundary of two liquids with different densities. As soon as the vehicle is completely submerged in the brine, visibility is restored. But the picture becomes different. The bottom of the lake is covered with a smooth layer of white and yellow crystals. There is no visible biological activity, silence and immobility. The brine hardly moves. It is too heavy for bottom currents to disturb it. This is a place where time moves differently than in the rest of the ocean. It was the 2020 find in the Gulf of Mexico that brought a new wave of public attention to brine lakes. The lake discovered by the Ocean Explorer team turned out to be relatively small, about 5 meters wide and several tens of meters long, but its condition was exceptionally good. The shores are densely covered with mussels and tube worms. The surface of the brine is untouched. The interface is distinct and stable. Scientists spent several hours over it, collecting samples and measuring temperature, salinity, and gas composition. The video recording of this dive went viral on the internet and gained millions of views because what was seen on it did not fit into any familiar picture of the world. A lake at the bottom of the ocean, water in water, a shore on which they live, and a surface on which they die. There is one aspect of brine lakes that researchers discuss least often because it lies on the boundary of science and something that is most difficult to describe strictly. This is the question of exactly what we see when we look at the shore of such a lake and what it tells us about the nature of life in general. The boundary of a brine lake is one of the most vivid embodiments of the principle that biologists call an ecotone. An ecotone is a transition zone between two different ecosystems, and it is almost always richer in life than each of the neighboring ecosystems individually. The edge of a forest is richer than both the forest thicket and the open field. The coastal strip is richer than both the open sea and the land. The shore of a brine lake is an extreme case of this principle. Here, two worlds are so different that one of them kills and the other supports life. And it is precisely at their point of contact that life reaches its maximum density, as if the proximity to death makes it more intense. This is not a metaphor or a poetic exaggeration. The biomass density on the shores of brine lakes is several times higher than the biomass density on a typical section of the deep-sea floor of the same region. There are more organisms here, more species, and more biochemical activity. The proximity to the deadly brine does not repel life. It attracts it because the brine is a source of energy, and the boundary between it and normal water is the place where this energy is released. The chemical gradient, the difference in the concentration of substances on both sides of the boundary, is the engine that turns this whole biological mechanism. A separate page in the history of brine lake research is their role in understanding how oil and gas fields are formed. The salt beds that feed the brine lakes do not just store salt. They are among the best natural traps for hydrocarbons. Oil and gas migrate through pores in rocks and accumulate where their movement is blocked by an impermeable layer. Salt is one of the most effective barriers of this kind. This is why the Gulf of Mexico, which is shot through with salt domes and diapirs, is one of the richest oil and gas regions in the world. Oil companies have for decades made detailed maps of salt structures on the bottom of the Gulf, unaware that they were simultaneously documenting the conditions in which brine lakes are formed. This neighborhood creates a certain tension. On one hand, intensive oil production in these areas has been going on for more than half a century. Pipelines cross zones where brine lakes are located. The catastrophe on the Deepwater Horizon platform in 2010 occurred precisely in an area of the Gulf of Mexico rich in salt structures. On the other hand, until recently, no one systematically studied how oil activity affects these ecosystems, partly because the ecosystems themselves were not described in detail. This is one of those cases where scientific knowledge has lagged hopelessly behind economic activity. Researchers working with brine lakes face serious technical difficulties. The brine is extremely aggressive toward equipment. High salinity quickly destroys the metal parts of submersibles, clogs filters and sensors, and creates problems with camera optics. Sampling brine requires special containers that seal hermetically at depth and maintain pressure when rising to the surface. Otherwise, dissolved gases instantly leave the solution, and the sample loses its original properties. Cultivating microorganisms from the brine in laboratory conditions remained practically impossible for a long time. Ordinary nutrient media are too dilute for them, and the ordinary atmosphere is too rich in oxygen. Many of the species described in publications have never been grown outside their natural environment. And everything we know about them was obtained by methods of analyzing DNA from brine samples. Nevertheless, progress is obvious. The appearance of relatively affordable autonomous underwater vehicles, drones that do not require constant control from a vessel and can hang for hours over the surface of a brine lake or circle around its shores, has opened new opportunities for long-term observation. Some research groups are installing autonomous monitoring stations on the shores of brine lakes that record changes in temperature, water composition, and brine levels over months. It is such long-term observations that are beginning to provide answers to questions that cannot be solved in 1 or 2 visits from a research vessel. The history of studying brine lakes is a story of how the planet continues to present us with surprises, even in those places that seem well studied. The Gulf of Mexico is not a wild, unexplored corner of the planet. Pipelines run along its bottom, oil platforms stand on its shelf, and its waters have long been mapped. And yet, in 2020, something was found here that made a team of experienced researchers literally fall silent before the screen. The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface. Its average depth is almost 4 kilometers. We have studied the surface well, the shallow waters and the edge relatively well, but what lies in its darkest and deepest parts remains a mystery. By some estimates, no more than 5% of the deep-sea floor has been studied in detail. Everything else is terra incognita. Terra incognita means unknown land, only underwater. Against this background, the story of brine lakes looks particularly instructive. They were not found in some inaccessible corner of the planet. They were found in the Gulf of Mexico, well studied, intensely used, and mapped lengthways and crossways. And yet entire ecosystems living here by their own laws remained invisible until someone lowered a camera low enough. How many such lakes exist in the world ocean, no one knows. This is not an exaggeration or a rhetorical device. We literally do not know. The brine lakes known today are only those over which a submersible with a working camera happened to pass, either by chance or by design. Targeted searches have not been conducted in most areas of the world ocean. No systematic catalog exists. Scientists working in this field cautiously say that the lakes discovered are probably a small part of those that actually exist. How small, one can only guess. There is something fundamentally important in the very fact of the existence of underwater brine lakes, something that goes beyond specific scientific discoveries. This existence says that the world is structured more richly and diversely than our theories allow. That where we expect uniformity, a water mass being just a water mass, nature manages to create a delimitation, a boundary, a separation, a special world. That life finds a way to exist where, by all rules, it should not be. And that the most interesting things on this planet are often hidden not at the other end of the world, but literally under our feet, or, in this case, under the keel of a ship that has already passed over this place hundreds of times.